The work is done, the crossing stands, and still they take our coin at the gate. That is close to the complaint a group of merchants from Bayonne put before the King of England. They were complaining about a charge at Astong, granted years earlier for one narrow purpose, paying off the builders. Those builders had long since packed up and gone, and the charge was still being collected. He sided with them. One royal decision, and a whole class of paying customer vanished off that ledger for good. Nobody asked the owner, and nobody had to. Say the bridge is yours. Here's what almost everyone assumes comes next. You have a river, one way over it, and no competition for miles. Build once, stand at the end of your own stonework, and let every cart and traveler who wants the far bank hand you money on the way past. It looks like the simplest fortune in the medieval world, a gate, a chest, and geography doing all the selling. Now read the line a clerk in London set down for the year 1420 to 1421. Rent taken in, £50 and 10 shillings. Tolls, from everybody who crossed, 15 shillings and 2 pence. Those figures explain themselves later. They are not the strangest thing here. The strangest thing turned up while I was hunting for a price. What did one of these sell for? What did a man pay to hold one? I searched every English crossing with surviving accounts, London, Rochester, York, expecting a gap in the record, a burnt roll, a missing deed. There was nothing to find. No lost figure, no damaged page, just a number that nobody ever wrote down in the first place. Before we go further, put a guess in the comments. How much would a stone crossing like this have cost to buy in the 14th century? Lock your number in now, because I want you to see how close you land. Start with the door, because the door is not made of stone, it is made of paper. In England, you could not simply decide one morning that people owed you for using a road. The King's Highway was free to travel, and that principle sat underneath everything. To charge anybody a penny, you needed a grant called pontage, a document naming which goods could be taxed, which people were exempt, and, crucially, for how long. Often it ran a few years and then died. Edmund Crouchback held one at Lancaster that lasted 5. So the first thing you own is not a crossing. It is permission, with an expiry date written into it, and a stated reason attached. The money is for the fabric. You are being lent a revenue stream on the understanding that you spend it on masonry. Written into that same grant is a list of everybody who does not have to pay, and it was rarely a short list. Local residents could argue the crossing was built for the town. Religious houses produced older privileges. Favored merchants held charters from a previous reign that outranked yours, and proving whose paperwork was older was a genuine branch of medieval litigation. Every exemption in that document is revenue you will never see, agreed to before you collected a penny. And people were watching the clock on you. Charge past the purpose the grant named, as they did at Hastings, and somebody eventually takes the parchment to the king and reads it back to him. The reverse could happen too. Up on the Scottish border, the men of Corbridge petitioned the crown declaring their town ruined by warfare and unable to keep its bridge standing at all, asking for pontage not as a license to profit, but as rescue money. That petition survives in the National Archives. It is a useful correction to the picture of the greedy baron at the gate. Sometimes the toll existed because the community holding the bridge had run out of options. Which brings us to what the masonry costs. In February 1382, a royal commission looked at the wreck of the old Roman crossing at Rochester and decided the place needed a new one in stone. Sitting on that commission was Henry Yeovil, the finest builder in England. 2 wealthy knights, Sir John de Cobham and Sir Robert Knowles, agreed to pay for it out of their own pockets. Work began in August 1387 and finished in September 1391. 4 years. What they built was 560 feet long and 14 feet wide, with 11 arches carried on 12 piers. The piers could not simply be dropped onto a riverbed, because a tidal river will scoop the ground out from under anything you put in it. So each one stood on a platform called a starling, around 40 feet across and 90 long, made by driving timber piles into the mud, packing the gaps with chalk, and decking the whole raft in elm. Somewhere above 10,000 piles went into the river before a single arch appeared above the waterline. Most of the money for a bridge like that ends up somewhere the customer never sees it. For a smaller job, you can watch the arithmetic close up. In January of 1421, 7 Yorkshiremen, Nicholas de Blackburn, Christopher Conyers, William de Burgh, and 4 others, sat down with 3 masons named Thomas Ampleford, John Garrett, and Robert Monsell, and put their names to a contract for a stone bridge over the Swale at Catterick. 2 piers, 2 abutments, 3 arches, finished by Michaelmas 1425, built to match the bridge at Barnard Castle. The masons took £20 in hand on the day. Published copies of the sum disagree slightly, so call the whole contract somewhere around £170 and leave it there. Everything interesting in that document sits outside the money. 7 patrons had to build the masons a covered wooden lodge with 4 rooms and 2 lean-tos, so the men had somewhere to live and work. They supplied the stone and carted it, wood and coal for burning lime, timber for the foundations, the centering that holds an arch up while the mortar sets and the scaffolding, and access to the quarries and control of the river itself while the footings went in. Iron and steel came across at the start, valued at 6 shillings and 8 pence. Each mason was promised a gown. None of that appears in the contract price. All of it was real. So the number you would quote as the cost of Catterick Bridge is a masonry bill with a small mountain of unpriced work standing behind it. And none of that mountain is what you will spend your life dealing with. Move forward a century, to London, and to a man doing the job you probably pictured when you clicked. In the accounting year 1537 to 1538, John Wood held the farm of the passage of carts and wains over London Bridge. £20 a year paid to the bridge house. Whatever he collected above that, he kept. This is not a model, not a round figure somebody invented to make a spreadsheet balance. £20, 1 man, 1 year, entered by a clerk who had no idea anybody would still be reading it 5 centuries later. Set it against a wage from the same accounts. A mason working on the bridge that year took 4 shillings a week. So Wood's rent, before he opened the gate on his first morning, before he hired anybody to stand in the cold and argue with drovers, came to 100 weeks of a skilled craftsman's pay. 2 years of a mason's life, due annually, whatever the river did. Look at the shape of that deal from both ends, because it is the oldest arrangement in commerce, and it is sitting right there in a Tudor account book. The bridge house gets a fixed sum it can plan around, without paying anybody to stand at a gate counting wheels in February. Wood gets every penny above that line, and he keeps all of it. When the roads are dry and the market is full, that is a good living. When the harvest fails, he still owes the same amount. The rent does not adjust itself downward because half the carts that used to come through are staying home. Somebody had transferred the risk, and it was not John Wood. Now, here is where I have to be straight with you, because this is exactly the moment you want a number, and the records refuse to hand one over. We do not know what Wood actually took at the gate. We do not know his rate per cart. No medieval English bridge leaves behind a traffic count. Receipts survive, tariffs mostly do not, and without both, you cannot work backwards to how many wheels crossed. Any channel quoting you a daily footfall for a 14th century bridge is guessing and hoping you will not check. What the records do tell us is stranger than a footfall count anyway. Wood is not the owner. He is renting a doorway from somebody else, and that somebody else was spending most of their year on a problem that had nothing to do with the gate. A bridge in water is not a finished object. It is a thing that is slowly coming apart, and your job is to lose that argument as slowly as possible. Look at what London bought in a single year, 1537 to 1538. 61,000 bricks at 4 shillings and 8 pence the thousand. £14, 4 shillings and 8 pence, gone on brick alone. The same accounts record 2,800 pounds of lead lost during melting and casting. Not stolen, not misplaced, consumed by the process of maintaining the structure. In the same breath, the clerk notes fresh lead coming in and 570 pounds of solder bought to go with it. Over in Southwark, the bridge house ran a working yard, a timber store, a masonry workshop, carpenters, plasterers, daubers, and smiths on the books. Oak and elm arriving, Kentish ragstone arriving, stone hauled from further off when the local supply would not do. Call it a budget line and you imply an amount somebody chose. This was closer to feeding something every week of every year at whatever rate it happened to be eating. Which raises an obvious question, and the answer to it is the first thing about this business that genuinely surprised me. Where does the money to feed it come from? Because it is not coming from the gate. The answer was upstairs, in a book on a table. Not a toll account, a rent roll, tenants entered by name, holding by holding, sum by sum, with the warden's hand resting on the larger of the 2 figures we started with. £50, 10 shillings in rent, 15 shillings and 2 pence in passage tolls. In carpenter's wages, using John Paris, who worked on that bridge for 8 pence a day in 1420, the rent is roughly 1,500 days of his labor. The tolls are about 23. Widen it out and the pattern holds across a century and a half. Income from lands and quit rents made up around 3/4 of everything the bridge estate took in by 1381, and by 1537 it had climbed to something near 7/8. And if you saw that coming, you are not just right, you are in company. Half the internet has already made that video. So let me give you the part that does not make it into the summaries, which is what that rent was doing legally. It fell due on a date from a named tenant under an agreement. Whether or not a single wheel touched the roadway that week made no difference to it. Roughly 500 people lived on London Bridge, a small town, stacked in timber houses over a tidal river. Every floor of it paid on a schedule that had nothing to do with traffic. Estate income climbed from £421 in 1404 to £796 by 1537. The stonework underneath it aged another 130 years in the same period, which makes the job you signed up for landlord work on a property that happens to be holding up a road. Except, and I need to introduce you to a man in York now, you might not be the landlord either. In 1393, Richard II granted the city of York the right to hold land and draw rents to pay for its two bridges, over the Ouse and the Foss. The men who ran that estate were called bridge masters. 27 of their annual rolls survive for the Ouse between 1400 and 1499, and 17 for the Foss. Reading them, you notice what is missing. Rents, chapel expenses, tenants chased, repairs to properties recorded, accounts enrolled at the end of the year. All of that is there, in detail, roll after roll. What the bridge masters did not do was collect the bridge toll. They also carried little direct responsibility for the fabric of the bridges themselves. Everything you assumed was one man's work, taking the money, keeping the stonework up, running the property, sat in 3 separate pairs of hands. And the man whose title had the word bridge in it was doing the one nobody would have guessed. York did charge a toll. We know a bound wain paid 4p there in the 15th century. What we cannot do is turn that into a business, because no count of wains survives to multiply it by, and the men keeping the surviving books were not the men taking the money. They swore an oath before they started. Their accounts were enrolled at year-end, with a fee paid to the clerk who wrote them up, and the whole thing checked. For the ambitious, it was a rung. The bridge mastership at York fed onwards into chamberlain, then sheriff, occasionally mayor, which tells you the post was worth having, without telling you it made anybody rich. London arranged the same split. Wood had the cart toll, the wardens had the estate, the payroll, the tenants, and the chapel. Craftsmen had the stone, and those wardens were not minor figures. 2 of them were elected at a time, generally established merchants, goldsmiths, drapers, men with a trade behind them. Christopher Eliot was a goldsmith. William Mariner held the post in 1506. They wore livery, dined with the mayor, and the post often ran onwards into an aldermanry or the mayoralty itself. Prestigious work, respectable work, the kind of position a successful man wanted his name attached to. Every one of them was standing under something that could take it all away in a night, and 2 of the 3 biggest threats had no engineering answer at all. Start with the smallest failure, because it is the one nobody would think to fear. London Bridge had a movable span, raised to let ships pass through. Ships paid for that. It was a whole line in the accounts. In 1537 to 1538, the stonework around it needed work, and until that work was done, the span could not be lifted. The clerk that year opened the ledger at the page for ship passage with his pen ready and nothing to write. The heading is there. Underneath it, for 12 months, there is nothing to say. One jammed mechanism, and a whole category of income stopped existing until masons finished a job somewhere else entirely. Now the river, which is worse. Winter, 1281 into 1282. Ice builds against the piers of London Bridge, and ice does not push the way water pushes. It leans, it packs, it finds the gap between the starlings, and it does not let go. The pressure keeps rising. 5 stone arches went into the Thames. Try standing on the bank the following morning. The road you walked on last week is a hole with cold water moving through it. The houses that stood on that stretch are gone. The shops are gone. The rent that came from them is gone, and it is not coming back next quarter, and there is no fund anywhere that covers this. The following year, the Bridge House was chartered. The disaster is widely credited with forcing the institution into existence. Rochester tells the slower version of the same story. Those 10,000 piles under the starlings were timber sitting in a tidal river, and timber in a tidal river is on a clock. Repair was not an event there. It was the permanent condition of the place, which is precisely why Cobham and Knowles went to Richard II in 1399 and asked for an institution rather than just a bridge. They had worked out that the crossing would outlive them and would still need feeding, and that no individual estate could carry that. They built a charity because they had done the arithmetic on a bridge, and the arithmetic said no person can hold this. And then there is the threat you cannot build against at all. In 1269, Henry III took the income from London Bridge and gave it to his wife, Queen Eleanor of Provence. That is the whole event. No flood, no ice, no collapse. The money went to the Crown's household because the Crown decided it should, and the structure was left to deteriorate while the revenue went elsewhere. It took a charter from Edward I in 1282 and another from Edward II in 1319 before the city held the thing securely again. You can engineer against weather and you can repair machinery, but a king who has decided he wants your income is a problem with no physical solution. The only defense anybody had was a piece of parchment, and parchment is granted by kings, who are entitled to reconsider. Which is exactly where the question I opened with starts to get uncomfortable. If the crown can take the revenue, and the tolls can be exempted away, and the wardens do not own the fabric, and the bridge masters do not touch the toll, then who is actually holding this thing? I keep running into this gap in these episodes, and this one is the cleanest example of it I have found. There is a difference between a business that earns and an owner who keeps. Most of history's famous fortunes turn out to sit on the wrong side of that line, and the medieval record is unusually honest about it once you learn where the accounts hide the answer. That gap is what the owner's ledger is about. It is the book I put together from the research behind this channel, the mechanics underneath these businesses, the ones the surviving paperwork will tell you if you know which column to read. Link is below if you want it. Because the answer to who held London Bridge is not a person, and once you see the shape of it, you cannot unsee it. Go back to the price. I looked for it properly. London, with the richest surviving accounts of any medieval English bridge. Rochester, with a trust that has kept its own archives since the 14th century. York, with 44 surviving rolls between the two rivers. 4 separate research passes, and then my own. There is no sale price for a medieval English toll bridge, anywhere. For a long time, I assumed that was an archive problem. It is not. The records are not incomplete on this point. They are silent because the transaction they would record was legally impossible. These bridges were held in mortmain, perpetual civic and charitable trusts, granted by royal patent, holding land in the name of an institution rather than a man. Rochester got its foundation from Richard II in 1399. Wardens and commonalty, empowered to hold property forever and spend the income on the crossing. London's arrangement did the same work through its own charters. A trust like that cannot be sold, cannot be mortgaged, and cannot be left to your son. There is no deed to sign because there is no buyer the law would recognize. And here is how the estate underneath it was actually assembled, which is the detail that convinced me this was never a business in the first place. It came in as gifts. Small ones at first, from Londoners of no particular rank, money and property left to the mayor and commonalty, or simply to God and the bridge. Rochester's endowment grew the same way. One of its donors was Richard Whittington, the merchant who really did become Lord Mayor and who the pantomime is loosely about. By the middle of the 14th century, something odder was happening. Some Londoners had begun naming the bridge house in their wills as a backup administrator, in case the trustees they had originally chosen let them down. They trusted a bridge more than they trusted their own friends. Women appear all through those records, as donors, as tenants, as widows holding leases and negotiating hard over them. There is a license recorded for a woman named Elizabeth Hind to transfer property for 20 shillings. What does not appear anywhere I could find is a woman elected as a warden. The property rights were real, the office was closed. So walk back down the ladder we climbed and count what each man actually held. John Wood rented a doorway for a year at a time. The wardens ran the estate and they were elected, 2 at a time, for a term of roughly a year or 2, ending in an audit of their accounts. That audit is the image I keep coming back to. A man carries a book into a room. Other men take it from him and they check it. Every payment he made, every rent he took, every load of stone he signed for. His name is on that book, and when they are finished with it, the book goes into the archive and he goes back to his shop. The next pair walk in behind him. None of the money he handled was ever his to keep. Bridge income was earmarked for the fabric, legally and institutionally. Those surviving totals belong to the estate, not to the man administering it. When I went looking for probate evidence tying bridge profit to any warden's personal fortune, there was none. Not for Elliot, not for Mariner, not for Wood. Real fortunes were made around that bridge, just not by anyone running it. The tenants did well, shopkeepers with a storefront on the busiest 100 yards in England, passing their leases down to their children. So did the contractors. Henry Yevil, who sat on the Rochester Commission and worked for kings, died wealthy enough to be buried at St. Magnus the Martyr, the church standing at the foot of the crossing he helped design. Which leaves exactly one group with no documented route to a fortune, and it is the group with the word bridge in the job title. Above them, there was nobody at all, only the institution. And that institution is still working. What began as Bridge House is now City Bridge Foundation, and it funds 5 London crossings today. 800 years of continuous operation. It has outlived every man who ever ran it, and for most of them, the only trace left anywhere on Earth is their handwriting in a roll that somebody else audited. The bridge keeps its own books. You are a line item in them. So let us settle the ledger honestly, gaps included. On the income side, rent, dominant and dependable, 3/4 of everything rising towards 7/8. Tolls, small and legally fragile, wiped out by a king's signature whenever he felt like signing. Market takings, offerings at the chapel. And if you preferred certainty to upside, a fixed farm from a man like Wood, who carried the risk for you at a price you could write in a book each spring. Against that, maintenance without end, skilled wages every week, brick and lead and solder by the ton, plus an exposure to ice, machinery, and monarchy that no reserve on earth would have covered. Now the gaps, because they matter as much as the totals. No traffic count survives, there is no secure rate per crossing, and no defensible annual profit margin either, since the arrears and the earmarked funds and the incomplete rolls between them make one impossible to build. Nobody's estate value can be traced back to the job. And there is no bribe in here. Whatever you might hope, the accounts do record dinners, including £4, 10 shillings, and a penny halfpenny on a single repast in 1501, but a clerk writing down a meal is not a clerk writing down a crime. Strip all of it back and an institution is what remains, which was always the point, though nobody running the place in 1420 would have phrased it that way. You did not own a bridge, nobody did, in 600 years of trying, because the law was written specifically to stop anybody from managing it. You got handed the keys for a couple of years on the thing's way through the centuries, and then it took your book, checked your arithmetic, and called the next one in. Say the bridge is yours. It was never a sentence anybody could have truthfully spoken. There is one more thing about that audit, and it is the detail I cannot get out of my head. The wardens knew all of this. They took the post anyway. 2 elected merchants every year, walking into a job that could never be inherited and never be sold, with an audit waiting at the far end of it, and they competed for the privilege. Which means something about that job paid, just not in coin, and not in anything that shows up in the column marked income. If you want to see what that something was, and how often the pattern repeats in businesses that look nothing like a bridge, the video on screen now is the one to watch next.